This lecture will continue to look at the rise of a new style in the 18th century following the Rococo with Neoclassicism, or the New Classicism, reviving ancient Greco-Roman art. Specifically with the author Winckelmann, the first art historian, and his insights on Greek sculpture and what that meant for contemporary art in his age, as well as the trend of the Grand Tour, taking trips down to see antiquities, specifically in Italy. Diderot, Reynolds, and Saint-Étienne all demanded that there be a new approach to art that ennobled it and was edifying, teaching a specific moral lesson, which moved beyond the art of the day. Aristocrats, of course, viewed their role in the commissioning of Rococo art as celebrating the spirit of jouissance, of the leisure appropriate to their station. Now, critics, much like those just discussed, would comment on the decadence of the Rococo, for paintings such as these do not celebrate, for instance, a moral or civic virtue, or uplift the common person to something greater. Instead, they are viewed as the indulgence of these immoral aristocrats. Lafont, for instance, cited Poussin, Lebrun, and Lesueur as models for this new type of art, for their role in a style that was clear, and that, of course, clearly communicated a message and a moral as well. We find here that Poussin especially was known for his didactic qualities and the affetti, these affectations or gestures that his paintings would include that clearly communicate what we should be taking from them. And of course, this was classically composed and derived, looking to classical statuary and art and in subject matter. Reynolds, on the other hand, would cite the grandeur in the High Renaissance, with artists such as Michelangelo and Raphael as the type of art that would inspire his grand manner, one that elevated us above the everyday and made us consider something greater than ourselves. So here we have a new style that he promoted that was monumental and also heroically idealized. Therefore, the models of each of these, both in England and France, had their common roots in antiquity, and it would be in the third quarter of the century that we move beyond the Renaissance and Baroque art to look to the purity of classical sculpture as the inspiration for this new art, this neoclassical art. The scholar who would formalize this new interest would be Johann Joachim Winckelmann, the German literary scholar who would move to Rome to become the librarian and surveyor of antiquities for Cardinal Albani. He would single-handedly create modern art history and scientific archaeology. He supervises the excavation of the ruins at Herculaneum in 1738 and that of Pompeii in 1748. Based on his experiences, he would write the reflections on the imitations of Greek works in painting and sculpture in 1756. Here we find that he would argue classical sculpture should be a model for art, as well as the improvement of society as a whole. What he wants is us to look like the statues of the ancient Greeks, because he actually believed that this is what they looked like because of their lifestyle. So he has a utopian idea of what ancient Greece is, in which we're going to be having people that live simply, they eat healthy, they exercise regularly, and wore loose clothes, which is the exact opposite of everything Winckelmann sees around him in the 18th century, with the overeating to excess, the lack of exercise, and corseted fashions that are so tight. So he believes that if we follow what the Greeks have shown us, and we can see it in their art here as a model to strive for, that we ourselves can also set up a utopian civilization. So this is what he wants as far as a natural lifestyle, engendering healthy minds and high moral standards. For as he states, the only way for us to be great is to imitate the ancients. And this is a sentiment that is repeated throughout the 18th century thanks to the revival of neoclassicism. Now, he establishes this canon of great art, or selects the most significant sculptures that we should pay attention to, like the Laocoon, like the Apollo Belvedere, and claims that great works embody the highest values of a culture. Therefore, they have a greater carrying capacity, as we discussed last time. But we have to select the right works and know how to identify the right works to best see the culture and its vision, ideals, and belief system. Therefore, he will define beauty as this mysterious and subtle quality, this quietness, this solemnness of Greek art, to where the figures are going to be perfectly composed and need not actually move nor ever say anything. Guiding this new ideal of beauty would be in the French le beau idéal and in Italian idea della bellezza, which comes from the Platonic idea, whereby we have this belief that the creator conceives of an idea, that being God thinks of creation, as this invisible prototype, which is of course inherently perfect and beautiful. But when it makes its way down to nature, i.e. us, it is imperfectly realized. Therefore, in the process set forth by the art theorist Giovanni Pietro Bellori on his Of the Idea of Beauty, he would argue that we have to think about this divine idea of what things should look like to purify these forms, and these can be seen in classical statuary. We see this as well in the 18th century with Mangs in his Reflections upon Beauty and Taste in Painting, the first neoclassical example in art, since Mangs was Winckelmann's friend and would implement his precepts. From art theory and Bellori, we have this idea that artists should synthesize instances in nature in order to get to this ideal and perfection as seen in the divine. Here we have his version of this process. In the explanation of beauty, the effects of beauty, it would be possible to find perfection in nature, although it is not found there. Art can surpass nature in beauty. In this beau idéal, we find that Mangs is going to write, quote, "By the ideal, I mean that which one sees only with the imagination, and not with the eyes. Thus, an ideal in painting depends upon selection of the most beautiful things in nature, purified of every imperfection. Thus, you are to look at nature, do life drawing, but purify it while also looking at ancient statuary." Also, to assist in this purification, the idea becomes aligned with contours. What is the contour of an object? Because hard lines are not found in nature and must be distilled or purified in order to get to this formal essence of things. In Franz Hemster's Letter sur la Sculpture of 1769, we have this notion that there is a sacred essence of line in a divine mission of drawing. This mission can be seen illustrated here in Joseph Wright of Derby's The Corinthian Maiden, whereby we have illustrated the story told by Pliny the Elder, the ancient Roman historian, which is going to chronicle where drawing actually came from. And that is with the first drawing seen here, made by a Greek maid from Corinth, who traced her departing lover's shadow on a wall to remember him. Thus, we have this notion of primitive purity and how we can distill perfect form through line. Both in the subject and the style here, compared to the Rococo, we find something that is stark and pared down, with no background here, with a restricted color palette. All the very opposite of Watteau's Return from Cythera, whereby we have this swaying, undulating composition moving us into the background with light, airy colors and open air and brushwork. This is going to be the backdrop for the Enlightenment here, whereby we find that the philosophical approach demanded that reason is going to be paramount and must reflect the results of physical experiments. Thus, empirical evidence is required, just like, of course, the notion of tracing something to prove someone was there. This leads to the birth of archaeology, which literally comes from the term from the beginning, or where we came from, as it investigates where human beings evolved from. So this leads to excavations, especially in Italy being the preferred area for digs, with Etruscan and Greek sites being excavated with vases that are collected and illustrated in catalogs at this time. Here we find one of these catalogs, shown here by Hamilton, whereby the vases are said to be very important to modern art, modern as in neoclassical art, whereby he will write, quote, "There are no monuments of antiquity that should excite the attention of modern artists more than the slight drawings on the most excellent of these vases. They may from them form a just idea of the spirit of the ancient Greek artists. Thus, in looking at these vases, they see a way to distill and replicate the pure style from antiquity, which was superior to the debauched style seen in Rococo art." This interest in Greek work, and especially Greek vases, was only compounded with the discovery of Herculaneum and Pompeii. It was August 24th, 79 Common Era, when Mount Vesuvius erupted, that we find two of the best preserved Roman cities buried for 1700 years. And this allows us to reconstruct life in, once again, the late Republic in Rome. The excavation of these cities took place in 1738 and 48 respectively, and allowed a glimpse into the art of antiquity like never before. The well-preserved paintings were very impressive by way of ancient Roman standards, but were considered trivial in content and poor in execution by the people that found them, like Winckelmann. It is not what they had imagined the glories of ancient art would be. Therefore, we find that it's also not as impressive as classical sculpture. If we're to look at these wall paintings in Pompeii and compare them to what people already knew existed in antiquity, like the Apollo Belvedere, it is very interesting. This led Winckelmann and others to the conclusion that the Roman period of art was actually a decline after the brilliance of ancient Greece. So Winckelmann moved to Rome in 1755 and was made the curator to Albani's classical collection. This led to the publication of the History of Ancient Art, which continued his understanding of ancient Greek sculpture as being the superior form of art. So we find that the model that Winckelmann sets up is going to take from Vasari this idea that every style has a biological evolution from birth to death. And so now Roman art was seen as the decline into old age, decrepitude, and leading to the death phase of classical civilization. Therefore, this book became very influential and was translated into many languages, and so it was commonly held in the later 18th century that Greek art is what should be imitated, not Roman art, which helps explain the style of neoclassicism. Citing as one of his preeminent examples of perfection in Greek art, we see here the Apollo Belvedere, which was actually believed to be a Greek original at the time, even though now we know it's a Roman copy. The description by Winckelmann is very telling, as he states that this example marries the ideal and the sensual, stating, quote, "Neither blood vessels nor sinews heat and stir this body, but a heavenly essence, diffusing itself like a gentle stream, seems to fill the contour of the figure," end quote. So here we can see that he is trying to get at this essence of the work as representing the ideals of Greek civilization that we should also try to emulate in society at this time. Now, Winckelmann never visited Greece because it was controlled by the Ottoman Turks at the time. Therefore, southern Italy offered the only information that the Western Europeans had at this time, specifically having excavations from ancient Rome and Etruscan copies and collections of Greek works. For instance, it would not be until 1801 that Lord Elgin is going to take the Elgin marbles from the Parthenon back to Britain. And of course, these are very disputed to this day. And so at this time, we had a more accurate example in the 19th century of what Greek art looked like, but not yet in the 18th century during the time of Winckelmann. This was the period of the Grand Tour, known by Winckelmann because he also is going to show the wealthy young men from Northern Europe, especially Britain, around the antiquities in Rome. The period in time this was most common, and the peak of the Grand Tour was 1760 to 1800. And the tour most commonly is going to run from Rome down to Herculaneum and Pompeii near Naples. We find at this time there was a traffic in antiquities and vedute and or images of antiquities and or these regions that held ancient treasures. This also gave birth to the new category of portraiture seen here by Pompeo Battoni of Lord Thomas Dundas of 1764, known as the Grand Tour portrait. So here we find that the portrait often accompanies a backdrop of antiquities hobbled together that one would see during your trip. All of these here are in the Vatican collection, such as the Apollo Belvedere behind him to the left, and the Laocoon, for instance. The interest in actual Greek monuments is certainly going to hold true, though of course the area is limited by way of who can go see it. But in London, the Society of Dilettanti, or gentlemen who made the Grand Tour of Italy, also sponsored an expedition in 1751, sending two architects, James Stewart and Nicholas Revet, to measure the ancient Greek monuments, specifically the Parthenon. Here they studied and measured and drew these monuments and came back and published them in a 4-volume work, The Antiquities of Athens, published between 1762 and 1816. Here we find that there is, based on the publication, a Greek revival. And so here we have an exactness of what the measurements would be, not copies of them. And this leads to a new interest and revival in interior decoration and in architecture as well. However, not everyone was solely interested in ancient Greek works. In Rome, we are going to find Giovanni Battista Piranesi, a Venetian printmaker, archaeologist, art dealer, and architect, seeking to revive Roman art and sees it not merely as derivative, but instead as surpassing the Greeks, especially in their monumental architecture, such as the Pantheon and the Colosseum, showing them as the greatest monuments in all of history. Of course, there is a reason that the Italians wished to showcase the grandness of ancient Rome, given that they saw themselves as the ancestors of the Romans and not the Greeks. In examples such as the Aqua Marcia Aqueduct, we see here in one of the magnificent views of Roman architectural series in 1765, an etching showcasing the large civilization that surpassed anything that exists today. Now here, on the greatness of architecture of the Romans, we have 38 individual etchings that are going to show monumental forms that are blown out of proportion and by scale are much larger than they actually were, to impress upon us the grandness of this tradition. Now, etching, unlike engraving, is a form of printmaking whereby you cover a copper plate with wax and then scrape said wax off with a needle. Now, this is dipped in an acid bath which bites or eats into the plate where the wax has been scraped away. The longer you leave the plate in the acid bath, the deeper and darker the lines become. So this is actually better as a printmaking process for imitating what actual drawings looked like with their uneven and swelling lines. Thus, this, accompanied with the exaggerated size, juxtaposing small diminutive figures with monumental architecture, is going to impress upon us the feeling, rather than the actual appearance, of these ancient Roman monuments and what they meant for Piranesi and others. Here we can find other examples surrounding Rome of monumental, behemoth structures like the pyramid here, or once again imaginative views of Babylon in the same way. Even though Piranesi is certainly interested in imitating the Roman style, most artists did not feel bound to one model or the other, following Greeks or Romans. Instead, they would imitate the art of antiquity as a whole. In the 1760s, we have different countries at a time, once again, that you're spending in Rome as a magnet for young artists coming from all over Europe. Thus, the term neoclassical will come into being 20 years later in the 1880s. But it is not a unified term we must keep in mind. It's not a unified style. Instead, we find that the Germans, like Winckelmann, are going to appreciate classical sculpture and see it as a utopian past of a golden age that we should aspire to reclaim. The Italians, such as Piranesi, are going to appreciate Roman architecture as an aspect of national pride for all Italians because they consider themselves Roman. Whereas the French and the British understand the classical context here in historical events and either admired or despised these events depending upon which was chosen. The first artist to implement Winckelmann's ideas was actually his friend, Anton Raphael Mengs. Now, Mengs is the first neoclassical artist who will implement this in painting. And we see that in a massive fresco, these new principles can be seen. Now we find that Mengs works for Cardinal Albani, also Winckelmann's employer, and he wants to decorate a new villa, a reception room for his antiques and his collection, much like the collection that the Carracci had decorated for the Farnese, where we find that the Farnese Heracles is going to be located. It is here that we have Parnassus, a massive 20-foot wide mural and fresco in the Villa Albani in Rome, whereby we have the different arts that are going to be shown here, all surrounding Apollo, centered on the stream coming from this river god behind Apollo's legs, streaming forth in the central lower section of this painting. This bright painting. Here we have the Muses to the left, Apollo, the Castalian spring, representing artistic inspiration in the center, and they're all located on Mount Parnassus. Now this does have a high Renaissance predecessor in Raphael, who presented the same subject. Now, the subject here is drawn from not only Raphael, but the individual figures from those appreciated most in the Vatican collection and of the greatest Greek artworks that precede Rome, one of them being the Apollo Belvedere. So it has been rightly pointed out that Apollo in the center here of Parnassus is going to be modeled on this very famous sculpture in the Vatican collection, with his arm up, wearing laurel wreaths, right? Having once again this cloak draped over his neck and arm. Now the shallow rectangular area and the screen of trees behind it is going to come from that classical tradition in the French Academy, popularized by Nicolas Poussin in his Et in Arcadia Ego as an example, just to show you, in which we have symmetrical figures, the same number on each side of the composition here, that are static. They're very still. Even those that are dancing are balanced by one another, and they are frozen. It is a very quiet and contemplative scene. Now you'll notice that we are abandoning, even though this is the same type of subject with figures out in a landscape, we're abandoning that zigzag-like motion, that organic fluidity that moves us through the scene that was made popular by artists like Antoine Watteau we looked at last time. So instead of moving through the scene in a very irregular fashion, now we have everything built on, once again, a very tectonic scene with these very straight vertical and horizontal grid-like lines anchoring the composition.
In addition, the composition itself comes from the subject as well, Raphael, in the High Renaissance. So in the High Renaissance, we have multifigural compositions like the School of Athens we looked at. Raphael also paints Parnassus in this same room, by the way. But we also are going to organize these large-scale monumental figures with a local color palette in ellipses. So just like Raphael had designed his in this elliptical orbit, so does Mangs. So here is the actual painting of Parnassus of the same subject to show you that it also is organized in an elliptical formation, all surrounding Apollo, the god of the arts, right? The aristocratic god of the arts, we might add.
As seen here with Mangs and other neoclassical artists, there is a dual reliance both on classical capital C, which are subjects from antiquity, and the classical approach as taken by high Renaissance artists. Thus, in his Thoughts on the Beauty and Taste in Painting of 1771, he would advise artists to study the works of the classical past to get a taste for beauty, and then append to that the style to express it of Raphael, Correggio, and Titian. Thus, we take classical subject matter and a classical style together. This is seen starting off in an introductory fashion in Joseph Marie Vian's Cellar of Cupids of 1763. Here we have a winner of the Prix de Rome that would travel to the excavations at Herculaneum and Pompeii and exhibited this in the Salon of 1763. The subject is actually based on a book devoted to these excavations, showing an old maid selling love to an aristocratic upper-class woman, shown as such symbolically as a cupid being handed to her. Now, Vian could have been a pupil of Boucher, but there are very significant differences here, even though the subject is similar. That being, we have a rather shallow space with an austere interior, with dull colors and crisp outlines, the complete opposite of Boucher's approach, which is, of course, going to be very suggestive and light and open in the same way. Diderot, of course, is going to criticize Vienne here in his Cellar of Cupids for its erotic content. As one can see here, the sale of love to rich Roman ladies is going to be a veiled commentary on the sex trade, because we find here the Cupid makes an obscene gesture with his arm, marking the length of pleasure that he promises, hence the length of the man's penis. So we have a new style here, for instance, a new restrained classical style, but the content is really the same as the Rococo, celebrating the loves and indulgences of the wealthy, of the aristocracy. This leads us to Benjamin West, the American-born artist who studied in Philadelphia and then moved to Rome, where he met Winckelmann and became a student of Mangs, eventually settling in London in 1763. He practices a form of neoclassical history painting, and he was one of the founding members of the Academy, along with Kaufmann and Reynolds. Here in his Agrippina landing at Brasidium with the Ashes of Germanicus of 1768, we have an example of his restrained neoclassical style, whereby we find here that the painting is new in content, but only slightly so in form and style. The subject comes from Tacitus, from his Annals, whereby Agrippina, wife of the Roman general Germanicus, would return to Italy with the cremated remains of her husband, who had been murdered in Syria. The murder, of course, ordered by the Emperor Tiberius. The progression and procession here of the women mourning the death of this great general is going to be an exemplum virtutis and taken from a classical model here. So the exemplum, of course, is mourning the dead, taking care of the dead, and respecting the sacrifice of this great Roman hero. Now, she honors her husband, and this becomes a moral example for her children who are at her side, that they should also support and mourn those that they loved and lost. The subject actually is taken from the Areopagus Augusti, which of course was commissioned by Augustus for his new social policies, especially involving women and children. Off to the side, we can see how Benjamin West copied in Rome this procession of Roman aristocrats moving from right to left in this example. Turning to his rendition with Agrippina, we find here that the classical mourners represent this moral, but this is added to this Rococo and Baroque series of spectators surrounding them, who are merely ordinary mortals. So if we look at Baroque paintings, such as that by Peter Paul Rubens and others, we see this explosion of emotion surrounding and edifying the significance of the figures in the center, whom we should emulate, not those surrounding him. So just like his death of General Wolfe, we are going to be focusing around the center, the focal point, the bullseye of the composition as to what we should focus on and find significant. This leads us to Angelica Kaufmann, one of only 2 women artists among the founding members of the Academy. She would be born in Switzerland and trained in Italy, finally moving to London like West in 1766. She would practice classical history paintings and would become known for them. She befriended Winckelmann and, of course, followed his precepts. Because she could not take anatomy classes, being a woman, meaning they could not be left alone or to see a nude man, she would compensate by studying nude statues. Thereby, she would make compositions for copyists for wall and ceiling paintings, and eventually would return to Italy in 1781 and stay there for the rest of her life.
Here in her Cornelia, Mother of the Graecii, we're going to have an exemplum virtutis, much like what we looked at with Jacques-Louis David, in that her work, as it is based in neoclassical ideals, is didactic, teaching us a moral lesson. The story that we have here is one of Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus, who are going to be 2nd century BCE reformers of the Roman Republic. However, they are children at this point, and their mother is going to be presenting them to a family friend, whose daughter is going to be following in line with the mother and is playing with jewelry. The story goes that the woman off to the right is going to invite, again, Cornelia into her home, showing off her jewels and her gold and her wonderful collection of material. And this materialist interest is going to be shared by the daughter who focuses on it. Then she turns to Cornelia and asks, "Where are your jewels? Show me yours." And Cornelia, having the correct motivation and belief system and goals in life, instead points to her 2 sons and says, "These are my jewels. These are what matter. Being a good mother and being a good wife, this is going to lead to great things as these will grow up, these boys, to reform the Roman Republic."
The figure of the son here is actually going to be Gaius, who holds a scroll, and his older brother Tiberius, who returned from school. On the opposite side, you have once again the daughter, Sempronia, who's going to be drawn to these jewels. If we compare the painting to Vienne's Cellar of Cupids, we see a similar composition which emphasizes a tectonic arrangement of vertical and horizontal lines in a sparsely decorated interior space in ancient Rome. But the difference is very clear, that being the subject matter no longer is going to be lascivious and not taken from Roman history. We find that the form is going to be the same, the style is the same, but the content, this moral model, is the important difference.
The organization of this pared down, strictly grave presentation, which of course reflects the Stoic Spartan approach of Cornelia in raising and educating her sons, is taken from Roman relief sarcophagi and relief friezes, where we move from left to right as these young boys are going to enter the scene to our left, carrying books and scrolls, showing that they are focusing on their education, where their mother points to them and looks down to the woman who then is going to be showing off her jewels and is seated. Obviously and very subtly, the superiority of Cornelia as a mother is going to be shown by the white and purity of her clothing, as well as how she is going to be above, superior, looking down at this other woman.
Here we can also see the type of art they're modeling their compositions on. For Kaufmann, a neoclassicist would prefer Poussin and the Poussinists, emphasizing rigid form and clarity of form, whereby their predecessors in the Rococo appreciated color, and colorists, right, the Rubenists, as this emphasized emotion. So they wanted a logical argument over an emotional reaction. So now, with Kaufmann, unlike West and her predecessors, we have a new neoclassical work here that is both classicizing in form, that being in style, and content. The subject is taken from classical antiquity. They both come together to something that is purely neoclassical. So next time we will see the developments of neoclassicism in France, specifically with Jacques-Louis David and his Italian counterpart with Canova.